They sold her like cattle for the price of a meal. But the man who raised his hand didn't see her scar. He saw a future. The noon sun sat heavy over the small frontier town, its light falling through a haze of dust and smoke as men crowded the square. Wagons stood in a line, horses tethered carelessly, boots grinding the earth, while voices rose and fell in cruel laughter. It was the day the women were to be sold, the day when shame itself was put on the block and men measured worth in coins and whiskey. Some leaned against posts, arms folded, eyes sharp with hunger. Others shouted for ale, their breath sour with the stink of old liquor. A rough wooden stage stood at the center, planks nailed together without care, and upon it the women waited, heads bowed, their dresses plain and worn thin. Among them stood Eliza. She kept her eyes on the ground, her hair falling like a veil, though it could not hide the burn scar that curved down the side of her face. It twisted her skin in a way that had made children point and grown men laugh for as long as she could remember. The scar burned hotter under every glance thrown at her, though the fire that had made it had long gone cold. She did not cry, for she had no tears left. Shame had drained them dry years ago, leaving only the hollow weight of being unwanted. The auctioneer bellowed out names and prices, his voice hoarse from smoke and drink. A woman with bright eyes was taken quick, a round of silver changing hands as two men argued over her until one prevailed. Another woman fetched a higher price when her youth was mentioned, her frightened hands folded over her chest as though she might hide her fear. Laughter rolled through the crowd with each sale, some boasting of the bargains they had made, others mocking the ones left behind. When Eliza was pushed forward, silence settled for a moment. Then came the jeers. 3 cents too much, someone shouted, and the crowd erupted in mean-spirited laughter. The auctioneer tried to stir interest, calling her strong and steady, fit for work, but his words fell flat against the scar that told another story. No man lifted a hand, no coin clinked against another. Eliza stood still, her eyes fixed on the dirt, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. Then a shadow moved at the edge of the crowd. A man taller than most, shoulders broad from years of cutting timber, beard rough, eyes steady. Jonas Hale stepped forward without hurry, his boots slow against the boards. He did not laugh, did not look at the men beside him, only at the woman before him. From his pocket he pulled 3 crumpled dollars, the kind worn soft from sweat and work, and raised them in his hand. The square broke again with cruel laughter. $3 for the scarred one, a man barked, slapping his knee. A fool, and his wages. But Jonas gave no answer. The auctioneer snatched the bills, eager to be done, and waved Eliza off the stage. Jonas reached her side, his silence as heavy as the pines he felled, and without a word placed his coat around her shoulders. The men still jeered, their voices sharp as knives. But Jonas only nodded once and led her away, not as though he had bought something broken, but as though he had just carried home a treasure no one else had the sense to see. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled over the rutted trail leading north, the sound mixing with the cry of distant crows and the soft rush of wind moving through dry grass. Eliza sat stiff on the worn seat, her hands folded tight in her lap, the coarse blanket bunched at her side. Every jolt of the wagon made her shoulders tense, waiting for the harsh words that always seemed to follow whenever she faltered or slowed. She waited for orders, barked in anger, for the strike of a hand, for the proof that nothing had changed, that men only knew how to remind her of her place. But the only sound from behind was the steady clip of hooves as Jonas Hale guided his horse a step back, his shadow long in the fading sun. Now and then she glanced over her shoulder, half fearing what she might see. But Jonas rode in silence, his face calm beneath the brim of his hat, his broad frame swaying easy with the horse's stride. He did not leer, did not smirk, did not fill the air with the sharp laughter of the men she had just left behind. Instead, when the evening grew cold and she shivered, he dismounted without a word and draped his coat over her shoulders. The wool smelled faintly of pine and smoke, of a man who worked with his hands and lived close to the forest. She wanted to refuse, pride rising sharp in her throat, but the warmth seeped in too fast and too kind, and she lowered her head in shame at the tears that almost slipped free. The trail stretched on, winding into country that grew lonelier with each mile. The hills swelled like the backs of sleeping giants, and the trees thickened until their branches blotted the sky in places. Eliza's scar prickled under the bite of the wind, the tender skin pulling tight, and she kept her head bowed so Jonas would not see. She thought of the jeers in the square, of the way the crowd had laughed when he gave $3 for her, and the memory burned as deep as the scar itself. She told herself he would demand his worth soon enough, that no man paid coin without expecting something in return. Yet when the wagon creaked to a halt near a stream, and he handed her a tin cup of water, he said nothing more than, "Drink," his voice low and even, not sharp, not cruel. That night they camped by the water's edge, the fire small but steady between them. Jonas set about cutting kindling, his axe biting into the logs with sure strokes, while Eliza sat, wrapped in his coat, her eyes following him in the firelight. He moved like a man used to silence, as though words were a thing saved for when they mattered. When he finally looked up, their eyes met across the flames, and instead of turning away in disgust as so many others had, he simply nodded once, like her presence required no explanation. Eliza's chest tightened at that small gesture, for it had been years since anyone had looked at her without scorn. She lay down on the hard earth with the sound of the stream in her ears, and for the first time in a long while, she slept without hearing the word ruined echoing through her dreams. The trail narrowed as the wagon climbed into country thick with pines, their tall bodies swaying in the wind, and their scent sharp in the cool air. Eliza pulled Jonas's coat tighter around her shoulders, her eyes moving from the endless trunks to the man riding steady ahead. He gave no warning of where the journey would end, no hint of what he expected once it did, and she braced herself with every mile for the moment when his kindness would fall away like smoke in the breeze. But when the wagon finally turned into a clearing, and she saw the cabin set against the trees, her breath caught. It was not large, nor polished like the houses she remembered from town, but it was strong and square, every log fitted clean, every joint pressed tight. The chimney gave off a thin curl of smoke, and the ground around it was stacked with cut timber, neat as soldiers in a line. Jonas climbed down and tied his horse, then moved to help her from the wagon. She hesitated, waiting for the rough pull of a hand, but instead he offered his palm open and patient. She placed her fingers there, trembling against his calloused skin, and he steadied her gently to the ground. Together they walked toward the door, his stride easy, hers unsure. The cabin loomed simple yet solid, a place built not for show but for surviving winters and storms. The door opened with a groan, and he stepped aside for her to enter first. Inside smelled of sawdust and wood smoke, warm and honest. The floor was worn smooth, the table sturdy, the stove blackened from long use. A row of tools hung against the wall, polished from care, and a pile of carved figures rested near the hearth, small animals cut from spare wood. There was no clutter, no sign of another soul, only the weight of a life lived in quiet labor. Eliza stood just inside the door, her hands clutched at the coat, not daring to move without being told. Jonas pointed to a corner where a pail sat, water still glistening inside. "Fresh from the stream," he said, his voice low. He showed her the stove, how it drew quick once kindling caught, and then walked to a narrow bed set against the far wall, the blanket folded tight. He tapped the wood frame with his hand. "Yours," he said simply. Her breath hitched. She had expected orders, perhaps the demand of a wife's duty spoken plain, but there was no claim in his voice, no shadow of cruelty. She looked at him then, her scar prickling under the firelight, waiting for the disgust she had seen so many times before. Instead, he only met her eyes and said, "You're safe here." The words settled heavy inside her chest, so heavy she almost broke beneath them. Safe was not a word she had ever trusted, not when men promised it and broke it with the next breath. Yet the way he said it, plain and without flourish, made her believe he meant it. She lowered her gaze, afraid of what might show in her face, and whispered a small thank you that barely reached her own ears. That night, after he stepped outside to split wood, she ran her fingers along the edge of the bed, the blanket rough beneath her hand. She sat for a long time staring at the walls, breathing the scent of pine and smoke, and for the first time in years, the silence around her did not press down like chains. It held her gently, like something that might be hers to keep. The first snow came early, drifting down from the gray sky in slow, quiet flakes that melted on Eliza's cheeks as she carried in kindling from the pile Jonas had stacked against the cabin wall. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, her breath a pale cloud before her. Yet when she stepped inside the small room, she was met by the warmth of the stove and the smell of wood smoke. Jonas had been splitting logs since morning, the sound of his axe steady as a heartbeat outside, and the pile grew higher with each hour. He worked without complaint, without pause for talk, the strength in his arms carving through the day as easily as he carved through timber. Eliza set the wood by the stove and turned to the kettle, filling it with water from the pail, her hands trembling though there was no one near to scold her. The cabin was quiet except for the hiss of the fire and the soft clatter of iron. Jonas stepped in after dark, shoulders dusted white with snow, his breath heavy but even. He set the axe aside, wiped his hands, and moved to hang his coat without a word. Supper was simple: beans, bread, and hot water steeped with pine needles that passed for tea. They sat across from one another, the table rough between them, the firelight catching on the lines of his face and the scar on hers. The silence hummed, not sharp or cruel, but thick, filling the air like another presence at the table. Eliza shifted in her seat, uneasy, every small movement loud to her ears. She reached for a bowl, and it slipped from her cold fingers, striking the floor and breaking into pieces. Her breath froze, her body folding in on itself as memory rushed back, the sting of her father's hand, the sharp curse of men who called her worthless. She braced for it now, waiting for anger to crash down on her. But Jonas only pushed back his chair and knelt beside the shards. His large hands picked them up with care, his voice low and steady when he said, "Not worth crying over." Then he carried the broken pieces to the corner and tossed them aside, brushing his palms together as though nothing had happened at all. Eliza stared at him, her heart racing, unable to understand. They finished the meal in silence, though the air felt changed. She dared a glance at him once, and found him eating steady, his eyes calm, offering no judgment. When the fire burned low, he added another log, its crackle filling the quiet, then laid his bedroll on the floor by the stove, leaving her the bed untouched. She turned onto her side beneath the blanket, eyes open to the dim glow of the embers. Sleep would not come. Gentleness sat heavier on her chest than any cruelty had. Cruelty she knew how to endure, how to steel herself against. But kindness opened her raw and trembling, as though it demanded something she did not know how to give. She lay there long into the night, listening to the snow whisper against the roof, and wondered why the absence of pain frightened her more than the presence of it. The wind rattled the shutters, and the cold crept through the cracks, as Eliza woke with a start, her body slick with sweat, though the air was sharp with winter chill. The dream clung to her as if it were real, the roar of fire filling her ears, the choking smoke in her lungs, the screams that had never faded even after all these years. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her scarred cheek, the skin still hot in her mind, though the blaze had died long ago. She slipped from the bed quietly, not wanting to wake Jonas, and crouched by the stove, feeding it a piece of kindling with shaking fingers. The flame caught slow, crackling in the silence, and she curled herself against its warmth like a child begging for comfort. She thought she was alone until she heard the low creak of the floorboards, Jonas stepped into the light, his broad frame casting a shadow across the small cabin. He did not ask why she was awake, did not demand she explain herself. He only crossed the room and lowered himself onto the chair opposite her, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes steady but not pressing. The silence stretched between them, heavy yet oddly steadying, as if he was holding the space so she could breathe. Eliza tried to force the memories back into the dark where they belonged, but the tears stung before she could stop them. She brushed them away angrily, ashamed to be weak before him, yet the words rose unbidden. "The fire," she whispered, her voice catching like dry wood. "It took everything. My mother tried to pull me out, but the roof fell. I was the one who lived." She drew in a shaking breath, pressing her palms together until her knuckles went white. I heard her scream, and then it was gone. And now, her fingers traced the burn that scarred her face, the mark that had drawn stares and laughter, the reminder that she had survived when someone better had not. "Now I wear this, and all they see is ruin." Jonas said nothing, his silence thick but not cruel. She waited for pity, for the soft words that always carried condescension, or worse, for the disgust that most men could not hide. But none came. He only watched her, the firelight catching on his rough features, his gaze steady, as if he were listening not to judge, but to understand. The quiet stretched, long enough that her heartbeat slowed and her trembling eased. It was strange, but his lack of pity felt more like respect than any kind word she had ever heard. At last he leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely, his voice low. "Fire leaves its mark," he said, and then paused as though weighing each word. "But it doesn't take everything." He did not look away from her scar, nor did he flinch. His calm acceptance cut deeper than sympathy, as though he was telling her she was more than what had been burned away. She lowered her eyes, ashamed of the relief flooding her chest, and whispered a soft, "Thank you," though she doubted he even needed it. Jonas gave a small nod, nothing more, and stood to place another log on the fire before returning to his bedroll. Eliza sat long after he had settled, staring at the flames, feeling the weight of her story in the open air, and for the first time in years, the memory of her mother's screams did not leave her entirely hollow. The days grew shorter as winter pressed in, the light fading quickly through the thick pines that surrounded the cabin. Jonas spent his hours hauling logs from the forest, his axe ringing through the air in steady rhythm, the sound carrying like a heartbeat across the frozen ground. Eliza helped as she could, keeping the fire fed, mending torn clothes, boiling beans in the blackened pot, yet it was in the quiet moments after supper, when the chores were done and the silence stretched long, that she began to notice something new. Jonas would sit near the fire with a block of wood in his hands, his knife flashing slow and sure as it shaved thin curls onto the floor. At first she thought he worked simply to pass the time, but as the days went on she saw shapes emerge from the plain timber. A bear with rounded haunches, a bird with its wings half raised, a horse with its head bowed as though caught mid-step. His big hands, calloused from swinging an axe and dragging heavy trunks, moved with a surprising care, each cut patient, each line exact. The firelight caught on the pale wood as the figures came alive under his touch, and she found herself watching him more than she meant to. One evening, when he had left a half-finished carving on the table, she reached out and traced its curve. It was a bird this time, its wings spread, though the grain of the wood cut across its body in a jagged scar. Her fingers lingered on that mark, wondering if it spoiled the beauty. Jonas glanced up from the fire, his eyes catching hers, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice low and steady, he told her, "Wood keeps its scars, doesn't make it less strong." The words settled deep, heavier than the silence that followed. She knew he spoke not only of timber but of her. She lowered her hand, ashamed of the tears rising quick, and turned away, though his gaze stayed with her. It was not pity, nor the cruel curiosity she had come to expect. It was something quieter, something that saw her without turning her into a wound. The next night, she picked up the small bear he had finished and turned it in her hands. Its back carried a knot where the knife could not cut smooth, and yet it looked strong, almost alive, as though it had walked out of the forest and into her palm. She set it down carefully, afraid to break it. But Jonas only gave a small nod, as if to say it was hers now. As the weeks passed, more figures gathered on the shelf above the hearth. Eliza began to arrange them. A bird beside a horse, a bear watching over them all. She caught herself smiling at the sight, though she quickly hid it, unused to how strange and full such warmth felt. Sometimes, when she ran her fingers over the scar on her cheek, she thought of his words, and of the wood that held its knots and flaws, yet stood strong against the years. And though she could not bring herself to say it aloud, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was not ruined after all. The snow had thinned enough for Jonas to hitch the wagon and head toward town. The road still rutted with ice, but passable if taken slow. Eliza rode beside him, wrapped in his coat, her stomach twisted tight as the rooftops came into view. She had not set foot among so many eyes since the auction, and the memory of the jeers there still clung to her like smoke. She wanted to stay hidden in the pines, where the only voices belonged to the wind and the birds, but flour was running low and lamp oil gone, and Jonas had said simply, "We need to go." His tone left no room for argument, though it carried no harshness either. They reached the general store near mid-morning, and already a crowd had gathered by the porch, men leaning against posts with their hats low, women whispering behind gloved hands. Word had spread fast on Winter Wind, and all of them knew the tale of the lumberjack who paid $3 for a woman with a scar. The moment Eliza stepped down from the wagon, she felt the weight of their eyes press against her skin. She kept her head lowered, the edge of her hair falling across her face, but the whispers carried sharp and clear. "Burned girl," one voice muttered. "Better off saving his money for whiskey," another answered with a laugh. Her chest tightened, her breath catching as though the fire itself had returned, burning through her lungs. She tried to make herself small, to fold inward until she disappeared, the way she had always done when the words came. But then Jonas's hand settled against her back, steady and firm, guiding her toward the door. He did not look at them, did not answer, only walked with his head high, as though none of it mattered. His touch was light, not a grip, not a claim of ownership, but a presence that told her she was not alone. Inside the store, the air smelled of kerosene and flour dust. Jonas gathered what they needed with calm efficiency, setting each item on the counter, while the clerk eyed Eliza with the same curiosity as the rest. She kept close to Jonas, her hands clenched at her sides, the sting of the whispers still burning her ears. She expected him to hurry, to finish quickly, and leave before the weight of shame grew unbearable. But he did not rush. He counted each coin carefully, his voice steady when he asked for what they lacked. And when he was done, he took the parcels in one arm and with the other pressed gently at her shoulder, steering her outside. The whispers flared again on the porch, laughter sharp in the cold air. Eliza's heart pounded, shame crawling over her skin, but Jonas's hand never wavered. He guided her past them all without a single word, as if their voices carried no more weight than the wind rattling the loose boards overhead. For the first time, she felt something stronger than shame rise within her, something fierce and hot, not because the insults had stopped hurting, but because Jonas's quiet act of claim burned hotter than any cruel word they could throw. When they climbed back onto the wagon and left the town behind, she kept her eyes on the pines in the distance, her heart steadying against the thought that maybe she was not just the burned girl after all. The morning sun broke through the branches in thin, pale beams, glinting on the crust of ice that covered the ground after a night of hard frost. Eliza stepped carefully, the hem of her dress brushing against the snow as she bent to gather kindling near the edge of the clearing. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, and the wood slipped more than once as she tried to stack it against her hip. She moved with caution, every step measured, her eyes darting toward Jonas, who was splitting larger logs near the cabin. His axe rose and fell in steady rhythm, the sound echoing sharp and sure through the still air. He worked with the same calm strength he always did, his face unreadable, and she felt again that tightness in her chest that came from never knowing what he was truly thinking. She shifted her bundle, stepped wrong, and the ground betrayed her. A slick patch of ice sent her feet out from under her, and she landed hard in a sprawl of snow and pine needles, the wood scattering from her arms. The breath left her in a sharp gasp, and she squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the sting of ridicule. The memory of men's laughter in town, of her father's cruel sneers, returned so quickly she felt heat rush to her scarred cheek. She waited for Jonas's voice, for the scolding or the mockery, but none came. When she opened her eyes, Jonas had paused mid-swing. The axe hung loose in his hands, his gaze fixed on her. For a moment she thought he might scowl or turn away, but instead, slowly, the corner of his mouth pulled into a crooked grin. It was small, rough around the edges, as if his face was unused to such a shape, but it was real. The sight of it startled her more than the fall had. For years she had braced against cruelty, but never against gentleness, never against warmth. Something inside her cracked at the absurdity of it all. Her legs tangled, her dress damp with snow, her arms spread wide like a child who had tripped on her own feet, and Jonas standing there with that rare grin. The sound burst from her before she could stop it, sharp and clear, a laugh that echoed across the clearing. It caught in her throat and spilled out again, louder, freer, and the sound startled her as much as it seemed to startle him. Jonas's grin deepened for just a heartbeat, and then he shook his head, returning to his work with the axe, though the faintest trace of that smile lingered. Eliza sat up, brushing snow from her skirts, her cheeks burning not from shame, but from the strange warmth curling through her chest. It had been so long since laughter had come from her, so long since it had not been twisted into cruelty or used against her. She touched her face, half afraid the scar would remind her of who she had been, but the laughter still hummed inside her, steady and alive. She gathered the fallen wood again, this time with a steadier grip, and when she carried it back toward the cabin, Jonas glanced up just once. Their eyes met, and no words passed, but something settled between them, quiet and warm, like a fire that did not need tending to keep burning. That night, as she lay beneath the blanket, the sound of her own laughter still echoed in her ears, and for the first time, she wondered if perhaps she was not broken after all. The storm rolled in sudden, carried on a wind that howled through the pines and rattled the shutters of the cabin. Snow fell heavy and fast, blanketing the world in white, piling against the door until Jonas had to shove hard just to make sure it stayed closed. The air inside grew dim as the clouds swallowed the light, and the sound of the storm became a constant roar that pressed against the walls. Eliza sat by the stove, her hands wrapped around a tin cup, and watched flakes whirl past the small window until the glass frosted over. By the second day, the snow lay so deep that even Jonas admitted there was no sense trying to cut more wood. They stayed inside, the fire burning steady, their voices few but not strained. Meals were simple: beans simmered with scraps of salt, pork, bread crisped on the stove's edge, tea brewed from pine needles steeped in hot water. They ate across from each other at the rough table, sometimes speaking, sometimes not, the silence stretching easy as though it belonged. Eliza found herself telling him small pieces of her past, not the worst parts, but the memories that surfaced in the quiet. She spoke of the creek she had played by as a girl, of the way her mother sang while she washed clothes, of how the fire had stolen it all. Jonas listened without interruption, his eyes steady, his presence like a wall that could be leaned against. He did not offer pity or answers, only let her words hang in the air as though they mattered. In return, he spoke little, though once he told her about the pines, how they bent under snow but did not break. If their roots were deep, she thought of that long after, sitting in the glow of the fire, her scar warmed by its light. On the third night the roof began to groan under the weight of snow. Jonas rose without a word, pulling on his coat and gloves, and went out into the storm. Eliza heard the scrape of his shovel, the steady thump of his boots on the roof, the crack of ice breaking away. The storm raged harder, and fear pricked at her chest, not fear of him but fear of the thought of losing the one person who had not turned away. She kept the fire burning, eyes fixed on the door until he returned, his beard frosted white, his shoulders soaked, his breath ragged from the cold. He did not stop to rest. Instead, he hauled beams from the stack of spare timber and braced them against the sagging rafters, working through the night as the storm battered the cabin. His muscles strained, his axe bit through wood, his hands blistered, yet he kept moving with the same steady strength he showed in all things. Eliza sat near the fire and watched him, not with dread as she once might have watched a man's power, but with a trust that grew each time he drove a beam into place. When at last exhaustion dragged him down, he sank into the chair by the stove, his head falling forward, his shoulders heavy. Eliza rose quietly, the blanket in her hands, and draped it over him with care. He did not stir, though his breath came slow and deep, the lines of strain easing from his face in sleep. She stood there a long time, the storm still raging outside, and felt something shift within her. She no longer saw his strength as something to fear, but as something that could shelter her, steady as the pines that bent but did not break. The thaw came slow, dripping from the eaves and turning the packed snow into mud that clung to boots and wagon wheels. The pines shook off their white coats, and the sound of running water returned to the creeks. Eliza felt the change in her own chest, as though each day of sunlight warmed something long, frozen inside her. She moved with more steadiness now, carrying water without spilling, tending the stove without trembling at every noise. Yet with spring also came the trips back into town, and though she tried to keep her head high, the memory of whispered names still clung to her like smoke on cloth. It was on one such trip that the past caught her unawares. The wagon rattled into the square, the horses snorting as Jonas reined them near the general store. Eliza stepped down, arms full of empty sacks to trade for flour, and for a moment all felt steady, almost ordinary. But then a voice carried sharp across the crowd, a voice she knew too well, one she had prayed never to hear again. "Well, I'll be damned," the man drawled, his spurs clinking as he strode from the hitching rail. He was a ranch hand she remembered from years back, a man who had laughed loudest when others mocked her, who had once called her a curse and said even the cattle turned away at the sight of her scar. His eyes narrowed when they settled on Jonas standing close beside her, and his grin curved mean. So the burned girl found herself a buyer after all. Damaged goods still fetch a price, I guess. The words struck hard, sharp as the first time she had ever heard them. Eliza flinched, the sacks slipping from her arms, her heart hammering like it had when the fire roared through her home. She wanted to speak, to tell him he was wrong, but her throat closed and the old shame rose like smoke. For a breath, she felt herself shrinking back into the girl she had been, ruined and unwanted, ready to fold under the weight of every sneer. But Jonas moved before she could retreat. He stepped forward, his shadow falling long across the mud, his jaw tight and his eyes steady as stone. The murmur of the crowd quieted when they saw the set of his shoulders, the stillness in his face. His voice came low but unshakable, carrying enough force to cut through every whisper. "She's worth more than you'll ever know." The ranch hand's smirk faltered, though he tried to cover it with a scoff. "Just saying what everyone's thinking." Jonas didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for the axe strapped in the wagon, yet the firmness in his tone left no space for argument. "Then everyone's wrong." Silence pressed over the square, broken only by the creak of wagons and the distant bark of a dog. Eliza stood frozen, her breath shallow, staring at the man beside her who had spoken the words she had never dared believe. Heat burned behind her eyes, not the fire of shame but the fierce spark of being defended, of being seen as something more than ruin. The ranch hand muttered and backed away, his bravado shrinking under the weight of Jonas' steady gaze. The crowd turned their eyes elsewhere, their whispers dulled. Jonas bent only long enough to pick up the fallen sacks, placed them back in Eliza's arms, and with a nod toward the store, guided her forward. He didn't look at her, didn't demand thanks, only moved with the same quiet strength he always carried. Eliza walked at his side, her scar burning hot against the spring air, but for the first time in her life, she did not feel the heat of shame. She felt instead the warmth of worth, as if his words had built a shield no cruelty could break. And as the store door closed behind them, she knew that old wounds might never vanish. But with Jonas near, they no longer ruled her. The night after the run, in at town, pressed down heavy on Eliza's chest. The fire in the stove glowed low, the room lit in flickers that stretched long shadows across the log walls. Jonas had gone about his work with the same steady silence as always, stacking the flour and oil they had brought back, checking the latch on the door, tending the tools he kept sharp and ordered. Eliza moved through the cabin like a ghost, her hands busy but her thoughts knotted until she could not hold them back anymore. The cruel words from the ranch hand echoed louder than the sound of wagons or laughter in the square, words that had cut years ago and still bled inside her, no matter how much she tried to hide it. When Jonas finally settled into the chair by the fire, his broad shoulders slumped from the long day, she found herself standing before him, with her heart pounding. Her hands twisted the edge of her dress, her voice raw when it broke free. "I'll never be more than the burned woman," she whispered, and the words shattered her like glass on stone. The tears came hot and sudden, sliding down her cheeks, as though all the years she had held them back demanded their turn. Jonas did not speak at once, did not dismiss her or look away. Instead, he rose slowly, the floor creaking under his weight, and came to stand close before her. His hands, rough and scarred from the saw and the axe, lifted with a gentleness that startled her. He cupped her face, his fingers brushing the ruined skin as though it were no different from the rest, as though he held something fragile and precious all at once. He looked at her fully, not skirting the scar, not pitying it, but seeing her. His voice came low, steady as the rivers that cut through stone. "You're not what they see." She tried to turn her head, ashamed of the flood inside her, but his hands held her still, not with force but with care. "You're not the name they give you," he said, his eyes steady on hers. "You're not a bargain. Worth isn't something they measure with coin. It's given, it's kept, and you're worth more than they'll ever know." Her breath broke, her chest heaving with sobs she could not swallow down. For so long she had fought to prove she was more than the scar, more than the ruin, and for so long no one had believed her. Yet here stood a man who did not ask her to prove anything, who did not measure her against what she had lost. The weight of that truth dropped her knees, and Jonas followed her down, still holding her face as though he carried something finer than gold. The fire crackled, throwing warmth against their skin, and Eliza felt something shift deep inside her. She had always thought worth had to be earned, that only those flawless enough, pretty enough, perfect enough, deserved to be kept. But as Jonas's words sank in, she understood for the first time that worth was not bargained. It was chosen, and he had chosen her. She pressed her forehead against his chest, his steady heartbeat loud in her ears, and the storm inside her began to still. Outside the night carried on, the wind rattling in the pines. But within the small cabin she felt something she had never known before, belonging. Not because Jonas claimed her, but because she chose to stand in that place in his hands and finally believe she was more than the burned woman. Spring melted into summer, and the pines that framed the clearing stood tall and green, their needles whispering in the warm wind. The snow was gone, the mud had dried, and with the new season came work that filled their days. Jonas turned the soil behind the cabin, breaking the hard ground with the strength of his back and the steadiness of his hands. Eliza knelt beside him, dropping seeds into the furrows, her fingers brushing earth that smelled of promise. Together they planted beans, corn, and a row of herbs she remembered her mother once tending. The garden grew slow at first, but when the first green shoots pushed through, she felt a stirring inside her chest, like roots finally reaching deep into soil that would hold them fast. Their lives became a rhythm of work and quiet joy. Jonas felled trees from the forest, his axe ringing clear as he dragged the logs back to the clearing, and Eliza learned to help him strip the bark and measure the beams. They worked side by side to build an addition onto the cabin, the smell of fresh, cut timber mixing with the smoke from the stove. Each new room they raised felt like proof that their lives were no longer just surviving but growing. The cabin that had once been a place of shelter now spread wider, filled with laughter that surprised her each time it left her mouth. Eliza no longer pulled her hair across her face when she went to the creek. She no longer turned away from her reflection in the water. Where once she had seen only ruin, now she saw strength. The scar that had made her shrink in shame still curved across her skin, but it no longer spoke only of pain. It spoke of survival, of fire endured, of the life she had fought to keep. She bent to the water and touched her cheek lightly, watching her reflection ripple, and for the first time she did not wish it away. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of red and gold, Jonas sat on the porch he had built, his hands resting heavy on his knees, his face calm. Eliza would sit beside him, sometimes with her sewing, sometimes with nothing at all, just listening to the quiet song of the woods. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It had become a language of its own, full of meaning, full of comfort. Love was not blind, she had come to understand. It did not ignore what was broken or hide what was scarred. Love saw all of it, the dark and the light, and chose to stay. Jonas had never told her she was beautiful in the way men often threw the word carelessly, but when his eyes lingered on her across the table, or when his hand brushed hers as they worked, she felt something truer. In his steady presence she had found more than safety. She had found a home. The seasons turned again, and the garden flourished, the new rooms filled with warmth, the sound of axes and laughter carrying through the pines. Eliza stood one morning at the edge of the clearing, the sun warming her scarred face, and felt a quiet peace settle over her. She was no longer the burned woman cast off to shame. She was Eliza, rooted in the soil, strong as the trees, and loved without condition. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.